Absolute truth belongs to only one class of people, the class of absolute fools. Those were the piercing words of the famous evolutionist and humanist of Princeton University, Dr. Ashley Montagu. Some time ago, Dr. Montagu was interviewed by the Atlanta Journal and Constitution newspaper. And in that interview, he made it crystal clear where he and many of his colleagues today now stand regarding your belief that you have between the covers of this book both absolute and ascertainable truth. If that's your viewpoint, says Dr. Montagu, there's just one word that would adequately describe you, and that would be the word fool. Probably doesn't come as any great shock to you this morning for me to tell you that in our day and age, not an inconsiderable number of people have begun to think, speak, and write just like that. In fact, if you were to take a survey of some of the literature issuing from the presses today, you might find, as I have, statements like these. Several years ago, Dr. Hampton L. Carson was presenting a presidential address to the Society for the Study of Evolution. In that address, he spoke about the origin of life upon the earth, including human life. These were his words. Since the very beginning of organized society, the purveyors of religious belief have traditionally reserved this area for themselves. Answers, however, have been sought through revelation, not reason. End quote. Or you might consider this statement from Dr. Kai Nielsen, former editor of the Humanist magazine. Dr. Nielsen says, in cultures such as ours, religion is very often an alien form of life to intellectuals. Living as we do in a post-Enlightenment era, it's difficult for us to take religion seriously. The very concepts seem fantastic to us. That people in our age could believe they've had a personal encounter with God so that they are born again in the Holy Spirit is something that attests to human irrationality and a lack of a sense of reality. End quote. Hurts just a little bit, doesn't it, brethren? A slap in the face, a stab in the back, an insult, to be sure. And I hope you understand by the time I step down from this platform this morning that it is no accident that these kinds of statements are being made. Whether you and I have come to grips with it or not, they are intended to be a slap in the face, a stab in the back, an insult. Because we are engaged in what has come to be called, and I think most appropriately so, the battle for the mind. It's the battle for the minds of our children, our grandchildren, our nephews, our nieces, and oh yes, even the battle for our very own minds, if we will, but for ever so short a time. Simply sit back, become somewhat apathetic, indifferent, or lethargic, and just be willing to let somebody else do our thinking for us. And I wonder if you and I have really understood the terrible toll that this is taking upon the nation that we cherish, the homes that are so important to us, and the church that we love so dearly. Scenario might go something like this. One Sunday morning, little Johnny comes bursting into Bible class. And this little boy is absolutely effervescent. He's bubbling over from the inside out with excitement. He grabs a hold of the Bible class teacher's coattail and tugs on that thing and says, Teacher, do you know what we studied this past week in school? Why, no, says the teacher. I don't know. What did you study, Johnny? And his eyes get as big as saucers and his voice races. And he says, you should have seen it. It was totally awesome. Our teacher showed us in the book. We saw the pictures. How that 3.5 billion years ago, on the side of the primitive earth, on a primeval volcano, some dry amino acids got together. Stayed there no less than 4 hours, but no more than 6. At exactly 175 degrees Celsius, after which time a warm, gentle rain came, washed them down the side of the volcano into a stagnant pool at the base, where they then, through time, chance, naturally occurring processes, turned into biochemical coacervates and proteinoid microspheres that gave rise to the first protoplasm, that gave rise to the first plasm, that gave rise to the first cell, that gave rise to the first multicell creature. And that's where my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather came from. Now, it might be true Johnny didn't put it in exactly those words. But lest you think I've just made this up for the purpose of some sermon illustration, let me assure you, I have not. What I have just presented to you, though in a nutshell summarized fashion, is the thermal concept of the origin of life upon the earth as espoused by Dr. Sidney Fox and colleagues of the University of Miami, and being taught in almost every, if not every, state-supported college and university in this country as to how life came to be on the earth. And yes, it's even in little Johnny's first and second and third grade books. Oh, the words are a lot shorter. Concepts a lot easier to digest. Basic idea? Exactly the same. And Johnny wants to know, is that really true, teacher? Really? And I'm afraid the answer we've given Johnny all too often, though we mean well, has gone something like this. Johnny, hon, where did you come up with a question like that? Hon, this is Bible class, and we've got to get on this morning with our lesson on faith, grace, love, peace, kindness, charity, Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt. But Johnny, the Bible says God did it. So Johnny quietly bows his head and shuffles back to his chair and sits down. He's been a little bit embarrassed. Made to feel as if, at the very best, he had asked a question that didn't quite belong. And at the very worst, a question that was entirely out of place. And so Johnny won't ask that question again. And brethren, I'm here this morning to tell you that's terribly sad. It's sad for 3 reasons. And please, this morning, do not misunderstand me. My sermon today is in no form or fashion a put down or criticism to or of our Bible class teachers. They do a wonderful job for the kingdom. That's not my point. My point is this. It's sad that Johnny isn't going to ask that question because, number one, if our children cannot come to us, their own parents and teachers and deacons and elders and preacher, for the proper answers to questions about their ultimate divine origin, pray tell, to whom may they then go? Secondly, it's sad for this reason. It is not a matter of if our children and grandchildren are going to learn something regarding their origin. They're going to learn something. The only question is, where are they going to learn it and what are they going to learn? Are you and I really going to be content to sit idly by and let some godless, hedonistic educator fill their minds with this kind of material? And it's sad for a third reason. Brethren, it's not a matter of our children not figuring this thing out. If we give them a false, or allow somebody else to give them a false, warped concept of their origin, you mark it down today, inevitably they will end up with a false, warped concept of their destiny to go right along with it. The two are inextricably linked and cannot be separated. You know what I think happened? I think along the way, we forgot. I don't think we set out to do it. In fact, I think it was completely inadvertent on our part. But somewhere along the way, we forgot how important this material that we've spent a weekend talking about was to the Lord and His inspired writers. And to get that point across to you today in a way that I think will help us not to make that mistake again, I'd like to do something this morning that I admit is very out of the ordinary for a guest speaker. I'd like to give you a homework assignment. It's not complicated. You won't have to write it down to remember it. It won't put you out much, won't take you long. But I think it'll get across the point that I'm trying to make to you. Here's what I'd like you to do. Today, after services, when you go home, before you sit down at the kitchen table and have a bite of lunch, do this. Take your Bible, sit down on the couch or in the easy chair in the living room. Turn to the beginnings of the New Testament and read the whole thing. But before you do that, take you a good sharp pair of scissors and cut out every single book in the New Testament in which there are direct or indirect references to, quotations from, allusions to the book of beginnings, the book of Genesis. Then read what's left. Before the hot water boils for your noon cup of coffee, you will have successfully completed reading 2nd and 3rd John and the book of Philemon. The only 3 you'll have left. Every single New Testament writer, without exception, reached back into that beautiful book of beginnings, the book of Genesis, to pluck important pearls to pull over into the New Testament upon which to build fundamental Bible doctrine. There are over 200 quotations from, allusions to, references to the book of Genesis in the New Testament, and over half of those come from the first 11, what we so often call creation chapters. Let me give you a quick sample. Anybody in here remember what was under discussion by the Lord in Matthew chapter 19? The Pharisees had come to verbally attack him over his stance on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And they said, Lord, we know what Moses let us do. What do you have to say about that? And the text makes it clear. They very much wanted him to contradict the law of Moses, and then that would drive the people away from him by the droves. Because those people revered and loved Moses as a great prophet, and rightly so. But the Lord, knowing the hearts of men, never contradicted the law of Moses. He reached all the way back behind the original law of Moses to the ideal laid down by God Himself in Genesis chapter 2. In fact, on that occasion, He even quoted verse 24 to them. For this cause shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and the twain shall become one flesh. To give those hypocrites, the Pharisees, the greatest single discourse the world has ever heard or will ever hear on one man, one woman for life, with one exception. You mean to tell me, Lord, you're going to use the Old Testament story of Adam and Eve to build the whole New Testament doctrine of marriage, divorce, and remarriage? Yes. 5 chapters later, do you remember what was under discussion? Jesus was talking about 2 things in chapter 24 of the book of Matthew. One of importance to the people of His day, one of importance to the people of all days. That first, He predicted the impending doom of the Jewish nation. And in AD 70, do you remember what happened? When the Roman army encircled the city, starved it to death, and the Jews were spread across the world. Just as Jesus had predicted. But secondly, Jesus also spoke about His prediction regarding the destruction of this globe at His second coming. And He said it will be for some of you on that occasion just as it was for the people in the days of Noah. They ate, they drank, they married and gave in marriage, and they perished. You mean to tell me, Lord, you're going to use that old, antiquated story from Genesis 6 through 8 of the destruction of the world by the global flood to draw a direct parallel to the coming destruction of the world at your second coming? Yes. First time flood, last time fire. Brethren, over and over and over again, these kinds of things are done by Old and New Testament writers. They reach all the way back into those first 11 chapters to grab things upon which they build fundamental concepts. But in my estimation, there is none that did it with such pristine beauty as the psalmist in chapter 8, beginning verse 4. The psalmist said, Who is man that thou hast considerest him, or the Son of Man, that thou hast visited him. Thou hast made him just a little lower than... You could fill in the blank this morning, couldn't you? You've heard the passage quoted often, haven't you? Thou hast made him just a little lower than, some versions put in the words, the angels. The American Standard of 1901 says, thou hast made him just a little lower than God. Kyle and Delitzsch in their commentary suggest perhaps the best translation would be, thou hast made him just a little lower than the divine nature of the Godhead itself. Brethren, I'm here today to tell you, that is a far cry from some amorphous, blob-like mass rolling up on some primeval seashore billions of years ago without a mind, deciding to grow a mind, 2 arms, 2 legs, stand up, walk off, turn around, and label the whole process an accident. God wanted you to know He went to great lengths to help us to understand we are not up from the slime. We are down from heaven. And not very far down at that. We're the only creature on this earth of whom it may be safely and accurately said, Genesis 1, 26 and 27, that we are made in the image of, after the likeness of, God. I wonder, have we helped our children, our grandchildren, to understand whose image it is that is stamped upon us? I am convinced, my friends, if we understood that, if we taught them to understand that, it would change their lives, our lives, irrevocably, unalterably, forever. In the image and likeness of God. But whatever happened to little Johnny? Oh, you parents know. Before we could blink once and turn around twice, as it were, all of a sudden Johnny went and grew up on us. He turned 18, 19 years old before we really knew what had happened. And finally the time came one day for us to boot him out of the nest and send him down to the university to get educated. And in one weekend's time, this little boy's life is changed forever. He's away from mom and dad for the first time. He's got a new roommate that likely he's never met before. He's just spent his whole summer's earnings for 15 hours, and he doesn't even know what hours are. And he's just about to figure out what all temperature cheer is all about. Monday morning, 8 o'clock rolls around. First day of classes, Johnny's got to be over in the science building up on the 2nd floor in an amphitheater about half the size of this auditorium for Biology 101. It's required, you know. So he perches on about the 3rd row. He's got his paper prepared, his pen poised. He's not going to miss a word this guy says. In the side door walks the learned professor. Crisp, white laboratory coat on, and beakers and test tubes tinkling in his pockets, and doctor's degrees behind his names, and piles of notes in his arms, which he sets down on that lectern with an authoritative thud. And the whole room comes to a reverenced hush. I'm the professor for this course, he says. And if you expect to pass my course, you will have to know, he says, reaching for one of those 2 books on top of the pile of notes. Johnny's had his eye on those 2 books. He recognizes that first one immediately. 3 days earlier, he just paid $79.95 for it over at the Student Union building. It's the textbook for the course. Hoisting it aloft, the professor says, if you expect to pass my course, you will have to know this book from the inside to the out, upside and down, forwards and backwards. You will be expected to do the review questions at the end of each chapter, turn them into my office every Friday in a double-spaced type format by 5 p.m. We will have 4 tests, a comprehensive final. I'll assign your 35-page term paper next Friday. Johnny's in utter shock. He hasn't been in class 5 minutes. He's behind 6 weeks already. And about the time he shakes himself back to reality, he notices the professor has laid aside the first book and is reaching for the second on top of that pile of notes. Johnny's had his eye on that book too, because it looks to him like he thinks it is. It's a Bible. And a warm spot wells up in his heart. A smile crosses his face. Johnny's feeling a whole lot better already. His optimism is short-lived. The professor picks up the Bible, and these are his words. And while I hope what I'm about to say to you is the exception and not the rule, and while most certainly it is not intended to reflect poorly on all professors or teachers, the story you are about to hear in its entirety is every word true. There may be some of you in this auditorium, says the professor, who are under this sadly mistaken impression that this book you call the Holy Bible is somehow going to be the textbook for my biology class. If that's what you're thinking, let me assure you, you could not be any more wrong than you are. And if you're one of those ignoramuses living in our highly enlightened 20th century technological society who still entertains the fairy tale type belief that there is some old gray-headed, bearded God floating around up in the sky, zapping things into existence in 6 days, 6,000 years ago, you change your tune this very instant, or you get up and you get out of my classroom because you don't belong in here with the rest of us. And with that, he takes this book and hurls it across the room where it lands in a corner trash can with a resounding pling that Johnny will never forget. Question. Did you equip Johnny for that kind of an assault on his faith? Brethren, he doesn't have any choice. He's in the literalist, truest sense of the words, a captive audience. He has to take the course. He has to pass it. He has to learn the correct answers and regurgitate them back on the examinations. He does not have a choice. So he sits there and he listens and he learns. That is, after all, what we sent him there to do, is it not? And as day after long, lonely day passes by, there is a battle raging on the inside of that youngster's mind and heart that few of you in this auditorium can ever really fully understand. But there's one thing for certain. He's not asking that question again. There are days that go by that he has to stick both of his hands into the pockets of his jeans just to keep his hands from going up. But he's not asking that question again because he remembers the response he got the first time. He's not asking that question again. Until suddenly one day, in an overwhelming burst of adrenaline, before he can realize what's happened, his mind forgets to connect to his arm and his arm shoots up, and before he can pull that thing down, the professor says, "Son, you have a question?" "Yes, sir. I've heard you talk all semester about how there's no God. And about how everything around us can be accounted for on purely naturalistic grounds through organic evolution. I just wondered, sir, is that really true? Really?" And then Johnny just cringes, waiting for the response he's certain is about to come. But he's wrong. Professor stops his lecture in mid-sentence, shuts his laboratory notebook, straightens his laboratory coat, Obviously departing from his prepared text, he says, "Young man, you have my apology." That's a very good question you've just asked. And by asking it, you have shown me that I have committed the greatest sin that any professor could ever commit. You have my apology, and that will not happen a second time. I assumed too much of my audience. I should have known better. I assumed wrongly that you and your classmates, having grown up in the intellectual milieu in which you did, understood. There is no God. God's a crutch for a bunch of sissies and weaklings who can't pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, who have absolutely no spine. Haven't you and your classmates seen, haven't you been exposed to the evidences from every conceivable field of human endeavor known to the mind of man that shows evolutions of fact like apples falling out of trees? It's as well established as the laws of gravity and the rotundity of the earth. Haven't you seen the evidences from comparative anatomy, comparative cytology, comparative embryology, paleontology, archaeology, genetics, natural selection? And the professor just dumps on Johnny. The kid can't even pronounce half the words the guy just used. Doesn't have a clue what they mean. But there are two things he does know. Number one, the fella gave him an answer. Seemed to be a real good answer. The guy had it sitting right at the tip of his cup, just waiting for somebody to ask. And secondly, mark it down, brethren. Johnny is impressed mightily. Midterm exam time rolls around. He's been up till 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning cramming for those no-good midterm exams. Putting the finishing touches on what seem to be thousands of note cards for rough drafts of term papers. And he's had it. He's wrung out like a dish rag, emotionally, physically exhausted. He just wants to get away and go home. Friday afternoon, 4 o'clock comes, last final's over. He gets in the car, heads down the interstate. 3 or 4 hours later, pulls up in the driveway, goes in the house. Mom's got his favorite meal fixed. They sit down, all the family together, and have a great time. That evening, they go in the kitchen, the living room, they sit and they chat some more. About 11:30, Johnny gets up, goes to his room, hits the bed, crashes, and dies. Child doesn't move for 12 and a half hours. Gets up about noon on Saturday, shaves and cleans up, takes a shower, goes down to Walmart, picks up a few things he's got to have down there to take back to school with him on Monday. That afternoon, he meets up with some of his friends. They're home for their break as well, and they go out and they play 3 or 4 sets of tennis, catch a movie together, go out and get a pizza. Saturday evening, about 11:30, he comes rolling back into the house, goes down to his room, hits the bed, crashes. He's gone again. Sunday morning comes along. 7:30. Mom walks into little Johnny's room, flips on the light, says, "All right, it's time to get up, Johnny. Go to Bible class and worship. By the way, did you do your lesson in the Bible class quarterly that I left here on the chest of drawers for you?" You didn't do your lesson in the quarterly? The crossword puzzle, the 4 fill in the blanks, you didn't? Well, it's not that big a deal. Don't worry about it. We'll just do it in the car on the way to the church building like we've always done. Get up. It's time to go to church this morning. No, says Johnny. I'm not going to church with you and Dad this morning. What do you mean you're not going to church with your father and me this morning? Of course you're going to church with us. You get up out of that bed and get ready. We're going to Bible class and worship like we always do. This is a Bible-believing, church-going family. No, says Johnny. I'm not going to church with you and Dad this morning. And then out from underneath the covers come the words that will haunt those two parents almost throughout an eternity. I don't think I believe in God anymore, Mom. I don't think I believe in God anymore. And as the screen door on the back slams shut and that child walks out, it suddenly strikes Mom and Dad with magnum force. Likely, their son will never darken those church building doors again. I am here today to tell you, brethren, 90% of the time they're absolutely right. He will not. And as they sit staring across the box of cereal on the kitchen table on that fateful Sunday morning, they're absolutely enraged with anger. And they want to know who's to blame for this. Well, you know who's not going to get the blame, don't you? They've got a major family crisis on their hands here, folks. They don't need a family fight added to it. They're not going to sit there and blame each other. You know who's going to catch the blame? Sure. The church is going to get the blame. The church makes an easy, convenient target. The church isn't sitting around the kitchen table on Sunday morning having a bowl of cereal. And Dad, in his anger, lights out at the elders. Sorry, elders we've got at that congregation. Biggest decision they ever made, whether to buy green and great songs of the church or blue great songs of the church. Nobody ever took any interest in my kid's soul. Boy, Mom, she picks up on that real quickly. She blasts the deacons with both barrels. Sorry, deacons, we've got biggest decision they ever made, whether to buy paper towels by the case or by the roll. Nobody ever took any interest in the educational program so my kid could grow and flourish. Dad unloads on the preacher. Sorry, preacher hadn't given 5 Bible-based lessons the whole time we've been here. No wonder the kid went sour. Mom levels the Bible class teacher. Never came by our house to check on our kid. Never gave him any homework. Nobody ever... But you see what's happened here, don't you? Sure you do. Long ago, brethren, Mom and Dad forgot 2 important points. Number 1, every time you get ready to point that finger out so you can effectively lay the blame at someone else's feet, you've still got 3 pointing right back at you. And number 2, and you hear me well this morning, our great God never turned the teaching function of the home over to the church in the first place. In Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 11, what was Moses trying to get across to the people of God? And in this regard, not one iota has changed from that day to this. Moses told the people, from the time you get up in the morning until the time you lay your tired, weary body down at night, you teach your children the Word of God. You embed it as frontlets between their eyes, embed on their doorposts. Train up the child in the way he should go, said the Proverbs writer, and when he is old, he will not depart therefrom. That is not idle chit-chat. That's the pledge of an almighty Creator God. And you know the questions that Mom and Dad don't want to hear? The questions they hope nobody but nobody thinks to ask? Questions like, when was the last time you had a family devotional with your children? When was the last time they had to stay with a friend, relative, babysitter, neighbor? Just because you had to go down the street, around the corner, across town, just to study the Bible to try to save someone's soul. When was the last time? On the way home from church services, Sunday morning, Wednesday night, Sunday evening, instead of them hearing us in their presence play fry, crisp, and burn, the preacher and elders and deacons, for every bit of minutia we can dredge up to discuss in their presence, when was the last time they heard us say something like this in their presence? Aren't we of all people most blessed to be in a congregation of God's people that's spiritually at peace? That has elders that will spend sleepless nights on prayer-bent knees before the throne of God, petitioning that throne for the safety and security of every one of these souls as if everyone were their very own. Aren't we fortunate To have a man of God who will stand behind this podium week in, week out, often at unbelievable expense to him and his family, and he's so effectively hidden himself behind that old blood-stained cross of Christ, we don't even know, we don't even care who he is. All we know and care about is the Christ crucified that he so effectively proclaims to us. When was the last time? I don't care if he's 5 or 15. When was the last time we pulled him close to our breast, hugged him real tight, looked into his eyes and said to him very simply, I love you. And I wanted you to know. No, Mom and Dad would just as soon nobody asked those questions. And I wish with all my heart, brethren, I could walk over and sit down. And as I did, look you in the face today with even a small measure of honesty and tell you, oh, this is just another sermon. Everybody lives happily ever after. Have a nice day. I'm not going to tell you that. There isn't a word of truth to it. It isn't just another sermon. Nobody lived happily ever after. In fact, I'm going to tell you what happened to little Johnny. And I know before I say another word, you're not going to like what you hear. I know because I don't like having to say it. And it won't surprise me today if not a one of you comes up to me after this lesson is over like you normally would a guest speaker on his last day and shakes my hand and pats me on the back and says, oh, Brother Thompson, that was just such a wonderful lesson. We just enjoyed that lesson so much. It's not a wonderful lesson. It's a rotten lesson, and you won't enjoy it. But it's way past time that somebody should say what I'm about to say. I want you to know that as I say it, brethren, I am aiming squarely for your hearts, not your toes. Do you know what happened to Johnny? I do. I'm the one his parents call in the middle of the night. I'm the one who has letters come across my desk practically every single week of my life. Letters written by mothers who are pacing the floor in the wee hours of the morning because they cannot sleep. Writing letters that you can't even read because the tears have dropped onto the ink and smudged the ink beyond legibility. But there is one thing that you know for certain when you open that envelope. Somebody's son or daughter is lost. The world painted for that child the most beautiful billboard of life you can ever imagine. Top left-hand corner. Good-looking, tanned, rugged individualist wearing a sheepskin coat, riding an auburn-colored stallion across the golden plains of Colorado, snow-capped mountains draped in the background, a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and the legend reads, the man of distinction. Top right-hand corner. Good-looking fellow, looks like he just stepped off the front cover of Gentleman's Quarterly magazine. Navy blue pinstripe suit, red tie, red kerchief, beautiful lady in one hand, glass of Jack Daniel's whiskey in the other, and the legend reads, where the man belongs. Bottom left-hand corner, very subtly, but very effectively presented. What's the matter, kid? You think you've got a problem, the solution to which you can't seem to find at the bottom of the bottle? No such problem exists. You've got the money. We've got the stuff. What do you need, kid? Uppers, downers, crack, coke, ice, angel dust, hashish, you name it. We'll put you on a high you won't ever come down from. Bottom right-hand corner of that great billboard of life, just 3 letters. S-E-X, bold, emblazoned. Kid, this is the new age of morality. Johnny, life is short. Play hard. Grab all the gusto you can. You just go around once. Go ahead, Johnny. Go for it. dare to ask yourself this morning, brethren, what do you think Johnny's going to do? The principles to which he once ascribed, the ideals he once held dear, he no longer does. He left them sitting in an old, dry, dust-covered book on a nightstand beside a bed in a room to which he will never return. What do you think he's going to do? And this morning, before I turn and sit down, I'd just like one question answered. I'd like to know why. Why we, the people of God, who humbly and reverentially wear His nail-pierced, blood-stained name as our own, who have at our fingertips, in our own mother tongue, the unequaled, awesome power of His inspired Word, why we couldn't seem to find the time with Him enough, why we couldn't seem to love Him enough, to take that great billboard of life and flip it over and show Him what was painted there on the backside in the dullest of blacks and the ugliest of grays. A story the world knew was there, we knew was there, but nobody seemed to want to tell Johnny was there. Why didn't Johnny have to go with us? You remember, don't you? Our trip recently up to the 3rd floor of the hospital to visit the young man 31 years old. He can't talk to you, of course. When he was 15 years old, he started smoking to prove that he was a man. 15 years later, he tried to quit to prove exactly the same thing. But it was too late. His lungs are eaten up with lung cancer, emphysema. He's got a little green oxygen bottle hooked on a belt around his hospital gown. He's got a mask permanently in place over his face. He can't even draw in enough air to get out a single sentence. So you talk, he listens. You talk, he listens. And after about 30 minutes of that one-way, lopsided conversation, you turn to leave, and when you say goodbye, you can't help but notice, though he tries to hide it, the single, solitary tear that drips from the corner of his eye to the pillowcase beneath his face. They buried him, you know. Left behind a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. The man of distinction. Why didn't Johnny have to go with us? You remember, don't you? The funeral we went to not long ago for the 3 teenagers. They were on their way home from a church party, minding their own business, having an absolutely wonderful time. But some drunk stumbled out of the local saloon, and in his besotted condition, he couldn't control that automobile in the middle of the night, which became a weapon. And he veered across the white line, bashed into their car, and sent all 3 of them straight to eternity forever. Why didn't Johnny have to stand with us on the brinks of those 3 open graves on that cold, gray, blustery February day while 3 pairs of parents dropped the fruit of their loins into God's cold, damp earth, this side of heaven, never to look into their faces again, just so somebody could be where the man belongs? Why didn't Johnny have to go with us? Why didn't we go in and roust him out of bed and make him go with us when that call came that morning at 3 o'clock? It's from a kid 15 years old. He's just been picked up by the local police, taken in handcuffs down to the local hooskow. They flipped him 1 quarter and said, "One call, kid, make it fast." Drug abuse. He doesn't know who to call. He's scared half out of his mind. He's 15 years old. He's not calling his parents, that's for sure. They don't have a clue what's going on. So you get a call at 3 in the morning. You get up, you put on your old grubby jeans and your tennis shoes, and you drive bleary-eyed to the city streets, and you get to the old government jail building on the corner, and you make your way down to those marred, scarred hallways, and if you live to be a million, you'll never get the stench out of your nostrils. And when you finally get to him, they've had to put him in the little room at the back that's padded, wall to wall, floor to ceiling, not even a doorknob on the inside. You look through that little steel mesh net glass window, and huddled over in the corner, by now wearing nothing but a pair of undershorts and vomiting his guts out because he can't get to the drugs to which his body has become so accustomed, is somebody's 15-year-old son. And a week and a half later, we will stand to preach his funeral. Why didn't somebody tell him? I know what the world told him, brethren. I've had it up to here with what the world